Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business. Hey, it's Michael Zapersky, and today I'm very excited to have Philip Ideson joining us. Philip, welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me onto the show, Michael.
All right, Philip. So for those who aren't familiar with your work, just take a moment and explain what you do.
Yeah, so I'm in the procurement space, for better or worse. Today, I own a company called CatalystCo and an associated podcast called Art of Procurement, where I really help procurement professionals kind of elevate the role of their teams. Procurement professionals struggle reputationally sometimes with a lot of folks in the business bypassing them, trying to avoid procurement, just like I'm sure many of your audience members try and avoid procurement if they can do on the other side. And so I'm really helping procurement professionals become a little bit more impactful and think about how to really go beyond the process so they can bring value to their organization. So people actually come and want to work with them rather than them having to feel like they got to throw a process or a mandate in front of somebody.
Yeah. So as you and I were just chatting before we jumped on here or hit the record button, certainly a lot of consultants, deal with that dreaded procurement department.
Yes.
So I want to pick your brain around that. And so for everyone listening, stay tuned because we're going to go deep into that topic really so that you can understand how to handle procurement, how to make more sales ultimately and do it in a way that feels good. Before we get there though, I want to kind of go back a little bit. You worked with, I believe, Visteon, Pfizer, Chiquita, I always think Chiquita bananas, Ally Financial, and then Accenture before going off and starting your own business. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a broad range. And that's kind of deliberate. I started in the automotive industry and I would see a lot of folks in the automotive industry who were kind of stuck in the industry once you'd been there for 10 years or so. And I just wanted to get a much broader set of experiences. So I deliberately chose, you go from an automotive company to a pharmaceutical company. And in the procurement world where I am, it's like chalk and cheese. Automotive, they have no money. Pharmaceutical, they have too much money. So their approach to procurement is very differently. So I wanted to get different experiences.
Very interesting. And what was the tipping point for you to kind of go out and build your own business? Like, why not continue in the corporate world?
Yeah.
Clearly, you're working with well-known organizations, kind of moving up the ranks. Why make that switch?
Yeah, I think it's something that I always wanted to do, from a very early age. And I always felt like I had to do it. And if I didn't, there'd always be some kind of regret of not trying it. I think in terms of why that point in my career, I came to realize there's never the perfect opportunity. And so I'd be waiting for the right time, waiting until I had finances in order or waiting until, there was an engagement delivered on a platter for me that, allowed me to walk straight into something. And I just realized that if I did that, I'd be waiting forever. And so, when I left, my last employer was Accenture. And I was part of a company that were acquired by Accenture. So I spent a couple of years there. It was a relatively, it was a good role. It wasn't something that was particularly challenging. And I just thought, why not? I really want to challenge myself. I'm not getting any younger. Let's do it.
None of us are getting younger. So
right.
Your core focus is procurement. I mean, you've built your business all around that. You have a procurement podcast, procurement is your world. Did you ever consider working in anything other than procurement when you launched your business? Or were you clear from day one on just the importance of keeping very focused on that specialization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I stumbled into procurement like a lot of people who are in our profession. When I started in procurement, I had no clue what a buyer was. I just knew that I got a chance to travel around the world and somebody would pay for it. So that sounded like a good job to me. In terms of my business, it was all that I knew. Let me back up. It's not all that I knew. In college, I did marketing, I studied finance, more general business. But from a professional perspective, procurement was really the only profession that I worked in. So it seemed to me that it was a natural kind of fit. Although I have often wondered, how can I look at expanding, kind of taking what I have as a transferable skill and applying it somewhere else? But I guess I've just never really taken that leap. It just seemed like the natural. That's kind of where my experience is. That's where I can probably have most impact more immediately. And so I guess I stayed within something that's more comfortable to me.
Well, it seems like a smart choice from my perspective. I think I see far too often consultants who don't try and really hone in on any type of specialization. They're trying to do all things and be all things to all people. And that becomes very challenging when you're trying to grow your business. I mean, the early stages, you might benefit and be quote unquote lucky to get referrals in your network and that can cast you in a direction for a while. But inevitably, when that kind of referral well dries up and you need to start reaching out to ideal clients, if you don't really know who your market is or what your real specialization is, it becomes very challenging from a marketing perspective.
Yeah, it's always interesting to determine like how far do you niche. So, when I think about niching, think of it as procurement and maybe there's a level down, but you're still more of a generalist within that profession. But then do you go further and further and further down and end up being, perhaps an expert in something that's extremely niched where there isn't a market? So I think that's a balance that I'm always trying to figure out, is how far do you actually go in niching? But I definitely agree, when I set out to start the business, it was all around, being involved in the niche that I knew. I didn't want to be going and thinking about, do I know what I'm talking about, even a topic that I know what I'm talking about. But if I went into something that I didn't, then that would show, and confidence is such a huge part of being a consultant.
Yeah, it certainly is. It's interesting, several of the consultants that we work with who are generating anywhere from like $500,000 to over $1 million per year as kind of independent solo consultants or very small consulting firms, typically with maybe like one assistant or one other person. Even at that stage, they're still evolving and getting greater clarity around their specialization, who their ideal clients are. I think that sometimes people who are new to this business or maybe any business think that this is something that, you figure out once at the beginning and then you never really have to come back to it. But what I've observed is that even as you continue to become more and more successful in terms of, growth of business and on the financial side, you still evolve, you still hone in, you still sharpen your sword, you still find ways to make the message even more relevant and align better as your business changes. And so I think that's just an ongoing part of the process. So I'm just kind of putting this out there for everyone that's listening, because I think that it's important to know that you don't just figure things out once and you're done with them. You're going to always want to keep coming back and keep improving.
Yeah, I think I always have a sense of I'm making this up as I go along. And I know that's not really what's going on. It's just that I'm always looking for new opportunities, new angles, thinking about things in different ways, because you mature as you go on this journey. So I'm a very different person than I was 3 years ago when I started on it. Maybe I was more naive when I started on the journey. But, as you have experiences, good and bad, you don't stand still. And I think it's important not to stand still. And by not doing so, I don't think means that it's chaos. It's just that you're continuing to evolve what you do, how you provide value, where you can actually be the best fit for somebody. And then, how you actually talk about what you do that is compelling enough for somebody to want to work with you. And I think that changes as well as you get more and more experience.
Right. Well, Philip, we have everyone now, waiting with bated breath. They want to know how they can deal with procurement. And I think it's interesting because you have perspective from both sides of the table, right? You've been working in large organizations in the procurement department, working with consultants, and now you work with people in the procurement department and helping them to become more professional and just to do their job better and to excel. But I think that a lot of consultants feel like the procurement departments don't understand what the actual consultant is trying to do. They don't understand the project that they've been, brought in to help with. And oftentimes their fees seems to get smashed and take a pounding kind of with that procurement sledgehammer, and all kinds of other challenges can pop up. So in your experience, Philip, what are some of the best practices that consultants should apply, when procurement is involved? And maybe we could even just start with like the mindset. I mean, for the average procurement professional or person working in an established organization, like what is really their priority? What drives them? What should a consultant know about procurement?
Yeah. And let me just say that as I now sell to procurement, I realize how difficult we can sometimes be to work with. It's, very different being on the other side of the table. I would say from a mindset perspective, I mean, honestly, procurement professionals typically don't set out with a singular mindset of, I just want to save money. It's very much driven by their goals and their objectives within their own organization. So if they're working for an organization that is in an industry that has small margins, then cost is going to be important to them. Some of the time, the mindset is they just want to be involved. They get frustrated when they find out about something at the last minute. And it's not necessarily that there isn't an opportunity for them to do anything or make a difference. It just feels as though they're being bypassed from the process. But ultimately, I would say that they're there for risk mitigation more than anything else. So, spending too much money can be seen as just a form of risk management. Helping their company not spend as much money as they think they should is risk management, as is, their ears are always going to be pricked up when they're working with smaller companies, because a lot of corporate procurement folks are taught that, the larger the company, the less the risk. And of course, that's not the case.
Sure.
But it's kind of a perception. So one tip that I would always give is just be as transparent as possible. Procurement folks typically aren't there to try and trip you up. And I would say if you find a company who acts like that, then maybe they're not the right company to be a client of.
So let's kind of walk through and start to apply some of this. So what I'm hearing is that the consultant really should try and get the procurement person, not necessarily get them involved, but once that connection is made, to really try and find ways to nurture or create a good relationship and let the procurement person know that, you appreciate their input, or that you're really to try and, focus on working together as opposed to trying to push a proposal through them as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I mean, I would suggest that you look at them as much of a client as, your ultimate client is. And so that is, everything you would do to try and nurture that relationship, you really want to try and do with the procurement professional, because there's two ways you can approach a situation where procurement gets involved. One is, why do I have to work with procurement? And then that will end up, no doubt, being a little bit more of a combative relationship. Or, the vast majority of folks in procurement are very broad-minded and entrepreneurial, but they're afraid of risk, which is why a lot of them ended up in procurement. So they get a big picture view of the business. They enjoy that, but they don't necessarily want to be on their own on the other side of the table. So being in a corporate job is obviously a lot safer. Right. But that means that they enjoy working with small companies, where they feel as though it's a collaborative relationship, and they will become an advocate. So if they are working with you, they believe in what you're doing, what you're trying to do, you're open, you're not trying to hide anything. You're talking about outcomes and the outcomes that you're helping your stakeholder or their stakeholders deliver, then you're going to have a much more, I would say, open relationship with them, where they will actually go and try and circumvent some of the processes behind the scenes. Because if they really want you to get the business, for better or worse, they'll find a way that you'll get the business.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think this point is important for everyone to really look at. Like, what I'm seeing is, from what you're sharing, Philip, is look at it less like a transaction, right? And more as a real relationship. And your tip of look at procurement as your client. I mean, for some people, they might think, well, that means I need to sell twice, right? It's like a lot more work. But in fact, from your experience, doing that is going to really help you to get a lot more business and probably make the whole interaction and communication process with that person much more enjoyable.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, one of the metrics that most procurement professionals will have is the number of suppliers a company has. There's always pressure to reduce the number of suppliers that a business works with. And so once you do have that relationship, then you're going to be in a much stronger position to get future business, because they really don't want to be going out and finding a new supplier. Finding a new supplier is a lot of work. You got to set things up internally with finance, with accounts payable, with filling in new forms, sometimes justifying a new supplier. So it's a lot of work that a procurement professional doesn't necessarily have the time to do. So once you are actually in there and you're doing a good job and you've built a relationship, they're going to be looking for ways that they can give you and more business.
And how often, in your experience, does procurement have the ability or play a role in actually going out and finding new business? And what I mean by that is that, someone in the organization says to procurement, hey, we need help with this issue, or we need a consultant to help us with this. Procurement finds someone. Is that a big part of it, or not so much?
It's not a helpful answer, but the answer is it depends. So there's a couple of different elements to that. If you think about the one element is the amount of money that a company is likely to spend on this solution. So most companies have a threshold that if it's over a certain amount of money, like in a contract or an annual spend, and it can vary based on the size of the company. It can be 50 grand, it can be 100 grand, it might even be $500,000, just depending on the size of the company.
Right.
Anything above that threshold, procurement has to be involved. Anything below that threshold, really the stakeholder or the business owner can go and source who they want, and procurement will just help to make sure that everything's in order.
Right.
So that's one element of it. If they've got a solution that needs solving, it's a relatively high spend. Procurement is likely to be, dipping into their toolbox to run a more formal pitch process to help find a solution. But if it's a lower spend threshold, from my experience, at least in the work that I do, a lot of what we do as smaller consulting owners is a smaller number. a lot of that is relational with the stakeholder, and procurement doesn't really want to get too involved in it.
Right.
You go to the other situation, you can have a point where, and this is called category management, where somebody has been tasked with looking at the consulting category as a whole and looks at it and says, you know what, I've got 50 consultants I'm working with here. I want to bring this down to 10. And so there'll be an exercise to actually go and streamline the list of suppliers that a company can do business with so that they're working with a smaller number of companies. So there may not actually be an event to source right now. So there may not be a project to source right now. But it's something that helps them be prepared for when the next business comes along, that they're only going to go out to, here's my 3 specialists in doing X versus I'm going to send this out to 15 different companies.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. One area, Philip, that I think a lot of consultants find challenges or kind of run into a bit of an obstacle is with their fees. And, especially when you're not just using an hourly rate, which is something that a lot of procurement departments or organizations are used to. That's kind of like their status quo. But for consultants who are really basing their fees more on ROI, more on value, so they're not maybe just using that hourly or daily rate type of metric, procurement often looks at that and says like, well, we don't get this. We don't know, where this is coming from. And that now causes a real challenge for the consultant using that model. What has been your experience around that specifically, and any thoughts or suggestions for consultants who are in that situation?
Hey, it's Michael here, and we'll be right back to the podcast. But first, are you ready to grow, scale, and take your consulting business and marketing to the next level? If so, our Clarity Coaching program may be a great fit for you. You'll work with our experienced team to set up a strategic plan for your business and coach you step by step in areas like how to consistently attract more leads, develop a magnetic message that resonates with your ideal clients, strategically package and position your services, earn higher fees, win more proposals, and scale your business. To find out more about Clarity Coaching and apply, go to consultingsuccess.com and click on coaching.
That's been my approach of pricing as well, is always to go value-based pricing rather than time and material. So it's typically a fixed fee, and I tie that to outcomes. So I think what's really important is tying it to an outcome, and that outcome is something that can be measured by the business owner. Because at the end of the day, it's the business owner that has the budget. And if the business owner is comfortable with paying that budget for the outcomes that you're promising, then there is less that procurement can do to try and negotiate. Why procurement wants to negotiate is because, that helps them in their metrics of saving money. It's not necessarily that they will look at that and say, oh, you're too expensive. But it's just that if the first quote comes in, and let's just say the first quote is 100,000, and they arbitrarily negotiate that down to 90,000, then they can claim the $10,000 in cost savings. And everything else is, to a lot of procurement folks, they're not looking into the details anymore than just being able to say, hey, I saved 10 grand on that contract. One thing that I would say, and it goes back to the risk again, is to be really clear. There's like a risk and reward element in the contract. So what a procurement person wants to know, if they can't get transparency into the hourly rates, because they will always ask, even if it's a fixed fee, they will ask, well, how do you make that up? And, that's not something you always want to share with them, because then that just opens the door, if they're that way inclined, to start picking up your fixed fee. So, they're wanting, again, to mitigate risk. So what is there from a risk mitigation perspective in your offer that if things don't go the way that everybody wants them to, there's some kind of recourse, and that may be that we'll put 10 or 15% of our fees at risk based on certain milestones, as an example. Even if it's in a type of consulting engagement where that isn't the traditional norm. So an example is one of the things we do a learning and development platform in the procurement space, and we tie risk and reward to that. So we tie outcomes and, how people perform as a result of that learning and development opportunity we give them to fees that we put at risk. And it's just very unusual in that space. And so for the procurement folks we work with, they love it because they just feel like we got skin in the game.
Right. And back to that example you just shared, where the consultant goes in, says here's what the investment is. It's based on value, based on ROI and so forth, and outcomes. And they get pushback from procurement saying, well, what is your hourly rate? How did you get to this number? Of course, they can talk about, well, this is the value to be generated, right? And focus on kind of the outcomes and the results. Is there anything else that the consultant should be thinking of? Any kind of wording or just mindset or, I guess, approach or examples that you could share of how to respond to that when asked by procurement?
Yeah, frankly, my approach typically is, and that I've had people do to me on the other side when I was buying consulting, is that we just don't price in that way. Our business model is to price on a fixed fee basis that's tied to our deliverables.
So stand your ground, stay confident, keep moving.
Because at the end of the day, procurement influences sourcing decisions. Procurement doesn't make sourcing decisions. And I would say the more progressive procurement organizations and those organizations that have been most successful in getting a seat at the table and therefore they're talking to you, we've already had those conversations with their stakeholder that I'm here to help make sure that you get value for money, that you're protected on the downside if something happens. But you, the stakeholder, the business owner, you are making the decision on what source that you're going to go with. And I'm here to help you make the best decision possible. So at the end of the day, they will have the overall authority of deciding this is the supplier that I want to go with. Now, procurement can present data to them as you go through this process that suggests that decision it may not be the best decision. And then they'll have some difficulty internally kind of justifying it. But ultimately, the business owner is the one that's making the decision from a sourcing perspective. And so if they want what you're offering, they're comfortable from a budget perspective, then I would definitely stand your ground. Look, this is your pricing model. This is the way that you price.
And I think this also makes it very clear why it's so important to focus on having a relationship with procurement. Because if you stand your ground, and as you just mentioned, they could share statistics or data or whatever it might be with the actual decision makers to influence the decision one way or another. Well, what kind of data or support do you think they're going to provide if you have a relationship with them versus if you don't? There's some really good points. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah. I just want to add one thing you can do, and it goes down the transparency line. And this is something we do as well, is you can offer indicative rates from a time and material perspective. Like these are the kind of levels of folks, and this is the range of price that we have built in for this level of professional. So at least they look at that and say, you know what, that's in the range of normal. And that's all sometimes they need to be comfortable. That's a struggle that procurement folks will have, is that when it's fixed cost, if they're digging for time and material, at least let them know indicative numbers of hourly rates. Just gives them comfortable that they're not being ripped off, because that's all they're really trying to achieve. Is they don't want somebody to come to them and say, hey, these guys ripped us off. How do I accept a price that's so high? And that just sometimes gives them a comfort level if they're really doing some more digging and asking more questions around that topic. Yeah,
that's a very good perspective. So, Philip, let's just spend a little bit of time here on something I'm very interested to learn more about, which is your model. You're running this community and kind of online learning platform to serve procurement professionals.
Yeah.
This is not the standard, not the typical route that a consultant takes. So talk to us a little bit about why you have gone this route. And then what I'm also interested to learn about is maybe, some of the challenges that you've encountered along the way so far.
Yeah. So, when I set up my podcast, so when I left the corporate world, the first thing I did was to set up a podcast in the procurement space, because there really wasn't any that existed. And I did that for a couple of reasons. One was to build my network. Two was to mature my thinking. With a platform, you have the opportunity to talk to people that you wouldn't ordinarily have the opportunity to talk to. And then hopefully build an audience of folks who know, like, and trust you. And then once you know who that audience is, you can start to understand what some of their challenges are, because they'll start to come to you with some of their challenges. And so what I found of one of the challenges of our audience is definitely in the development of their people. That they look at traditional methods of training not really being effective for all kinds of reasons that, I don't need to go into here. But when I was kind of modeling the business, I didn't want it to be just all on consulting. That's kind of a peak and a trough.
Right.
Engagements we have going on. And, you get into the consulting engagement, you're kind of forgetting about the business development. How do you try and go away from it being boom and bust? So I wanted something that had more of a recurring revenue stream. So there seemed to be an opportunity. We had a large, Fortune 100 client who asked us to pilot something with them in this space, which we did with them. And it just kind of presented an opportunity to say, okay, let's go and take this and take it away from the pilot and make it into a product, so that we can sell the learning and development platform that we built on a subscription basis.
Right. And that model is a very smart one. As you said, one of the biggest challenges that consultants face is just like the roller coaster of income and the roller coaster of delivery versus working on the actual business.
Yeah.
So as you've been now building it, I mean, what have you been finding? Because it is a different model that for many consultants, they're not as familiar with. But what have been maybe some of the unexpected challenges or maybe even expected challenges that you've confronted?
Yes, I would say that definitely a challenge is that these things take longer to get off the ground than you may hope. And so there's still an awful lot of selling. There's an awful lot of things that aren't scalable that you have to do at the beginning. You know, and honestly, we're still in that phase. We're in the phase of getting people engaged in the platform so that we can have a certain number of, and we sell this platform to individuals and to corporates. It gets to a certain tipping point. You know, when it gets to a tipping point, then it actually will start to run itself a little bit more. It gets better known. There's probably a lot less one-on-one personal touch that's needed. But to start with, it's still a very personal. Like there's as much that goes into a sale sometimes of a $700 a year subscription than there is a $50,000 consulting engagement. So you really need to be able to put the work in. But with it being recurring, the work that you put in the beginning then bears fruit later. And so the objective with this platform is that the platform ultimately generates enough revenue to pay the bills, which then gives us the time and the freedom, if you will, to really be a bit more selective in the consulting engagements that we take on. So they're more strategic, you know, aligned with growing the business and projects that we actually enjoy that we want to get involved in.
Got it. So you're doing both. You have the platform and then you're also still doing kind of custom consulting for organizations.
Yes. And I would say that I don't think the custom consulting will ever go away. And the reason for that, putting aside all financial reasons why we may want to continue to do that, is that what's great about consulting, even if you have a business which is recurring, you know, bringing recurring revenue, is that it really just helps you empathize with the clients and the prospects because you're on the ground level, if you will. You know, it's really easy. What I've found, at least my experience the last 2 or 3 years, is when you take a step back from the day to day, you can really easily lose touch with what's really going on or lose some of the empathy of the real day-to-day challenges that your clients and your prospects may have. So you come over as sounding like, you know, those consultants that we all hate that know everything, but don't actually do anything. And so I really want to continue to be involved in consulting because it gives me, as things change on the ground, I can react to that in my business. Yeah,
no, those are really good kind of experiences to have you share, especially that it takes real work to get this kind of platform that you have off the ground. Previous company that my cousin and business partner, Sam, and I started was a job board business, and we sold that at the end of last year. But it took us like a very long time at the beginning of just working like all different angles, because it was kind of like a chicken and egg, right? You have to have the users and you have to all like the job seekers and you have to have the employers. So you have to really hit it from both angles. And so it took us a lot of time before the platform and kind of site got to a point where it really just, the business ran itself. And it was a very nice passive income business for many years for us. And we just decided to sell so we could focus more onto consulting success, which is the direction that we've been going for many years anyways. But you're right. I think it's also important that you're mentioning this because a lot of people, just in the day and age that we're in, it's like online, passive income. I want to just go and build a product and
press a button.
Right. But the reality is it's not that easy. You have to be prepared to put in a lot of work. It's like any type of business. And in some cases, you know, a much more direct path to generating income is just going out and getting a consulting client, because it's typically going to generate more revenue for you from one client than you'd have to sell a lot of courses or products or whatever to equal that. But the approach that you're taking by doing both, I think, is a really good one, and one that I've employed as well over the years. Yeah, it's definitely an opportunity cost of investing all the time because it just does take so much time. However, as you say, I'm kind of looking at this from a long-term perspective. There's a lot of compound effect that you can take advantage of when you're building that kind of business. It just takes a long time for those very, very, very small kind of compounds to turn into anything meaningful. Once they do, then that's when the snowball starts to get bigger and bigger. At least that's the strategy with this business. Yeah, for sure. It's all about finding something that you really enjoy doing, that you see is going to provide, you know, great benefits into the future as well. And just find meaningful work, really, not just chasing it for the money. And I'm excited to see, you know, where this path continues to take you. Yeah. And the kind of approach that I took to this was, we're not doing anything new. We're bringing things to the procurement profession that the procurement profession hasn't seen before. But it's not like we're reinventing the wheel.
And so I think that's something that's interesting for a lot of listeners when they're looking for new sources of revenue is there's lots of great ideas. There's lots of great products that are being very successful in other verticals that aren't your own. How can you look at bringing those in rather than just inventing something from scratch?
Well said.
Because, there's already a well-trodden path that people have taken to apply it. And at the end of the day, professionals are the same, whatever their professional function or department or whatever it is that they're focusing on. A lot of the tenets and the challenges are all the same. They just have different words and, different language. So look at things that are working somewhere else, see how you can bring them and adapt them and contextualize them for the area that you work in.
Well, this has been really great, Philip. I really appreciate having you come on and share, your experience and wisdom in this area of procurement. 2 questions before we end off here, though. First of all, what book are you currently reading, or maybe have you read in the last little while that you just really enjoyed?
That's kind of stumped me. As we talked about offline, I've been in the middle of a cross-country move. And so reading has probably taken a backseat. They've been non-business related and actually audiobooks. In fact, I'll give you one that I did read, that I listened to recently.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a business book. It can be just any book that resonates. Yeah.
No, this one was Rand Fishkin of Moz.
Yep.
And I think it's called Lost and Founder. I listened to it as an audiobook, but it's just about the trials and the tribulations of being a startup founder. And, that along with a couple of other interactions I've had with folks recently, just kind of bring home the fact that we should all be more open and honest about the journeys that we're on and the challenges that we have, because I think far too often we try and paint a picture of everything in the garden is rosy and we have this brand and everything's going great. And, business at the end of the day, we talked about procurement, it's human to human. And so just injecting a little bit more of yourself and your challenges and what you're doing into how you portray yourself, I think is really powerful, because it helps people want to root for you and they want to help you then in any way that they can. I
think that's a really important statement and a great way for us to end off. I couldn't agree more. I think, just sharing some like vulnerabilities and insecurities and just being open, because you're right. It is all about relationships. It's human to human. And so the more that you open up, the more that people feel like you're actually connected with them. Right. So a great reminder there. Now, Philip, for everyone who wants to learn more about your work and what you're up to and see this kind of online portal and community and platform that you've built, where's the best place for them to do that? Yeah,
so there's a couple of different places. So the podcast, anything that you may ever want to know, and probably a lot more that you don't about procurement, is at artofprocurement.com. And then the platform is called the CatalystCo platform, and that's at CatalystCo.io.
Fantastic. We'll have all those links in the show notes. Philip, thank you again so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Michael. And if anybody would like any tips on navigating procurement or any challenges that they have, I'd be happy to help out.
Terrific. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.